Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Since those twin shocks of Brexit and Trump back in 2016, one of the main narratives from the establishment has been these things happened because of outside interference. Yes, we're back to our old friend, the Russians. We've had Ben Bradshaw, Labour MP, standing up in the House of Commons and saying that Russian money was put into the Brexit campaign. In America, we've reached levels of total hysteria. I mean, so much so that apparently I was acting as a Russian agent. I'm going to be arrested the next time I step foot on American soil. And we've gone as far as having the special investigation by Mueller into the Trump presidency, and was there or was there not collusion? That debate's been going on for a very, very long time. Interesting that today YouTube said it had not found evidence of Russian groups buying ads to influence Brexit. Facebook found that about $100,000 had been spent from Russian sources on advertising. I mean, piddling amounts compared to the billions that were spent on the American election. But the debate about foreign overseas influence in Western democracies is a big one. Now, I have said from the start that I believe, and please tell me I'm wrong, but I believe that Russian interference actually is almost negligible. It's being dragged up as an excuse. But I have felt for some time, in fact, I felt for the last 6-7 years, that there was one major global influence. And by the way, I'm not inferring for a moment anything illegal has been done here, but I'm talking about one massive attempt by a very rich man to change the politics across the whole of the west of the world. And I spoke about this in the European Parliament as recently as last November. This is what I said.
I just wonder, when we're talking about offshore money, when we're talking about political subversion, when we're talking about collusion, I wonder whether we're looking in the wrong place. And I say that because George Soros recently gave Open Society, his organisation, which of course campaigns for free movement of peoples and supports supranational structures like the European Union, he recently gave it $18 billion. And his influence here and in Brussels is truly extraordinary. Open Society boast that they had 42 meetings last year with the European Commission. They've even published a book of reliable friends in the European Parliament. And there are 226 names on that list. If we're going to have a debate and we're going to talk about full political and financial transparency, well, let's do it.
Now, over the course of the last 20 years, I've raised many questions about organisations, about money, about legitimacy, and in turn, they, of course, have been asked of me. Let me tell you, when I wrote to the 226 MEPs he listed as friends, I got the odd sarcastic answer, but I didn't get any factual evidence back that any of them had attended his meetings or, of course, been financially backed by him. But it's really, really interesting to wake up this morning and to see the front page of the Daily Telegraph, which put out the story that the pro-EU campaign, Best for Britain, the one that Gina Miller is famously involved with, had received a £400,000 donation from George Soros. What is Best for Britain all about? Well, it's all about stopping Brexit. It's all about forcing a second referendum. Remember, I talked about this a month ago. I said I feared a second referendum may be on the cards. And I'm pleased that the Telegraph have broken this story. Because, you know, in those 20 years, I've been called every name under the sun. The one thing I'd never been called, until I questioned George Soros, is Semitic. But apparently, if you criticise George Soros, you are anti-Semitic because of his Jewish Hungarian birth. And I wondered from the start whether perhaps they were trying to hide something. Open Society, his organisation, has received so far over $20 billion. No, not million, $20 billion. This is the biggest, best funded political campaign the Western world has seen in its entire history. It's my belief that he is funding a web of organisations in Britain, in Europe, in America to push his agenda. He is pro-European Union. He is pro the EU taking at least 1 million asylum seekers every single year and many other things. He hates Trump. He hates Brexit. But I'm asking you the big question. Are you worried that Western democracies are being influenced by overseas interests? And if you think, yeah, like me, if you're really worried about this influence and the fact that it's not really been spoken about very much, then call me on 0345 6060 973. Maybe you think it's irrelevant. It makes no difference. We're big enough and ugly enough to make up our own minds, in which case text to 84850. Or maybe you think it doesn't matter what we do. Foreign governments and big foreign billionaires will always try to shape events in their interests, in which case you can tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And of course, you can watch me on Facebook. I'm here in the London studios, and you can comment there too. Linda is calling from Manchester. Good evening, Linda.
Hi, Nigel. What about the Legatum Institute? That's a really hard Brexit. That takes a really hard Brexit stance.
Yes.
And their offices are based in the Cayman Islands. Their
Yes.
chief executive, I think, is Christopher Chandler, is a New Zealander.
Yes.
He actually applied to Malta for Maltese citizenship so he can gain EU access. So, I mean, what's that about? I mean, it works both ways.
Yeah, you're quite right. Christopher Chandler is a New Zealand billionaire. He's made his fortune through trading opportunities and disruption in financial markets. And yeah, he does have the Legatum Institute. It's well funded. It's in London. It's got some very professional people working for it. It's campaigning for free trade deals for the United Kingdom outside the European Union. Linda, you are quite right. The Legatum Institute exists. The point I'm making, Linda, is that is all very out there and very public. And in terms of the size of money involved, it is actually pretty small. The point I'm making is that when I spoke in November in the European Parliament about Open Society, George Soros's institution, which funds a whole network of institutions, it seemed to that point nobody had even discussed it. And maybe, Linda, you would agree with me that a political campaigning organisation that had already received over $20 billion was something worth discussing.
Well, personally, I think anything that can keep us in the European Union, to me, is worth pursuing.
Okay.
And, it's just my stance. I think we're better off in Europe.
I see. So
we're friends with Europe.
So
We're
the rules
all
don't matter.
European.
So the rules don't matter.
Well, I'm not saying the rules don't matter. I'm just saying, I mean, there's that goes on both sides. I mean, as I say, you've got Dyson, who's really hard, Brexiter, and he makes all his products in Malaysia. So basically, you're all the same, but you're all feathering your own nest for whatever it's worth. I mean, I feel safer, and I feel my interests are better served in Europe rather than leaving it to the open market and our government.
Well, that's a slightly separate issue, Linda, although Soros is very firmly on that side. And, I quote, the European Union should accept at least 1 million asylum seekers every year for the foreseeable future. And we know that about him. Ironic, actually, because he made £1 billion selling sterling short at the time of the exchange rate mechanism collapse. But hey, that's back in ancient history. Linda, the point I'm making to you is there have always been wealthy people and companies that have had institutes like Legatum to campaign and lobby for their interests and their beliefs. What I'm saying to you is the scale of Soros's Open Society is unlike anything we've ever seen before. They've got more money than most governments in the European Union. And that, Linda, I think is worthy of debate.
Yeah, but at least it's up front, not like Legatum. Legatum are actually campaigning for a hard Brexit while their chief executive officer is getting Maltese citizenship so he can be still, so he's still got EU access.
Where did you last hear George Soros being interviewed? And by the way, I did ask him for an interview on this show. Where did you last see George Soros, Linda, interviewed? When did you, and I don't suppose you heard my speech in the European Parliament last November, when did you, until today's front page on the Telegraph, ever hear about George Soros's political influence in this country?
I've heard of George Soros, and obviously I know he's a billionaire.
Yep.
But personally, Nigel, I think as long as it can help us stay in the European Union...
Yep, so any cause, any money, foreign money, dirty money, as long as we stay governed by the old men in Brussels, eh?
We're our own governors, Nigel. We are a sovereign nation, no matter what you might think, and I like the European Union.
You cannot be a sovereign nation.
So obviously,
you cannot be a sovereign nation, Linda, and a member of the European Union, can you?
We are a sovereign nation, Nigel, and I'm so glad I haven't got grandchildren, but I do have godchildren who are young, and I worry about their future. And I just hope we can have another referendum to stay in Europe.
Well, if we have another referendum, we may well go back to losing all our sovereignty, Linda, and you'll be very, very pleased. Not the debate we're having tonight. Dennis is calling from Bournemouth. Dennis, good evening.
Yeah, good evening, Nigel.
So is there too much overseas influence in British politics?
Well, I think the short answer is obviously yes. I mean, you quoted Soros, and there are others, of course. But the important thing here, Nigel, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, is that this is going to be a coordinated Remain campaign. It's going to have money, it's going to have rallies, it's going to have television adverts.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we really do need to get together. There are too many disparate groups. You've got your platform on LBC that's absolutely fantastic. There's Leave Means Leave. There's Campaign for an Independent Britain.
Yep.
There's all disparate groups. You've got Rees-Mogg doing his bit over here, and so on. What we have to do, us Brexiteers, we have to pull together all these disparate groups. It needs leadership, it needs money, it needs a strategic campaign.
Dennis, I absolutely understand what you're saying, and I'm frustrated by it. So should we take money from overseas nationals through their foundations like George Soros to do it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you've got Aaron Banks, Dyson's been mentioned, and I honestly believe we can get money from the grassroots. Let's not forget that 420 constituencies in this country voted Brexit.
I know.
There's money there. There's £10 here, £20
No, Dennis, I don't disagree. Now, Linda, who was on before you, who backs us staying in the European Union, is prepared to accept money from anywhere. Would you, Dennis, from Bournemouth, be prepared to accept Russian money to make sure we stay outside the European Union?
No, I wouldn't, but I tell you what I would like to do, Nigel. I would like to write to you privately and put together a draft, bare-bones strategy to get the coordination that we need, to get a campaign on the road and fight this overseas investment and these campaigns that have got people like Blair in them, Adonis, etc., etc. Now,
Dennis?
I don't know if I'd be able to do that if anyone would give me that.
Dennis, you write to me, Dennis. You write to me, Dennis, and I promise I'll read it, and I promise I'll answer it, and I thank you for your call. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's now 7:16. Ever since those twin shocks in 2016 of Brexit and Trump, we've been told it is foreign interference that caused these amazing results. It's the Russians. And goodness me, people have tried so hard to prove it. As such, they have not managed to pin anything on Brexit or indeed on Trump. But what I've been arguing now for a few months, or a few years actually, is that there's a man called George Soros out there whose organisation, Open Society, doesn't have millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions, but billions. Over 20 billion so far that it is using, spending, campaigning for organisations like the European Union, campaigning for mass migration, and as we've learned overnight from a Telegraph front page story, has given £400,000 to Gina Miller's campaign to keep us inside the European Union. I'm asking you whether you're worried that Western democracies are being influenced by overseas interests. Now, Linda, before the break, perfectly correctly said that the Legatum Institute was funded by a New Zealand billionaire. Linda, you're right, and they have a budget of $4 million every year. They are not insignificant, Linda. I bow to that point. But against that, we've got Open Society with its many billions to spend every year. And I'm arguing we need to have a proper debate about the role of George Soros, not just in this country or America, but right across the European Union and the Western world. I think the Russian thing is nonsense, but I do think we should be discussing the role of Soros. Now, when I did this back in November, as I said earlier, I was called anti-Semitic for doing it. I thought, why on earth is this wave of trolls on Twitter and Facebook attacking me? I've never been called this before. Just for the record, folks, and George Soros was born 87 years ago in Hungary, and he was of Jewish birth. That is true. But when he's asked in an interview, Mr. Soros, are you religious? No. Do you believe in God? No. He may have been born Jewish, but actually, I would say he's an atheist. All right? And I think the reason some on the Remain side and the left are throwing this tag of anti-Semitism is they're scared what's going to be uncovered over the next 2 weeks. And I'll make you one promise. This £400,000 that's been given to Gina Miller's campaign to keep us in the European Union, you will know within a few days, is literally the tip of the iceberg. Many other organisations will appear in the next few days. You'll even find out about former prime ministers who have very close relationships with a man whose organisation boasts 42 meetings with the European Commission last year. Tim is a new caller to this show. He lives in Dorking. Good evening.
Hello, Nigel.
Hello there.
It's interesting you spoke about the fact that we're possibly looking in the wrong place when it comes to Russian interference.
That was my view, yeah.
Yeah, I'd actually go as far as to say that it's the establishment and Soros who are actually putting this Russian story out there to try and effectively put a smokescreen across their own activities. They're the ones interfering, not the Russians at all. I think Facebook did an investigation and found that there was some minuscule amounts of interference on their website.
Yes,
the referendum.
But what makes you, Tim? Okay, you've come on with a very big assertive claim. What makes you think? And I've got my suspicions. What makes you think Soros is a big player in this?
Well, let's not forget, in the early 90s, he trashed our currency when we came out of the ERM. He made £1 billion, I think it was, and he bragged about it, the fact he'd made all this money out of our currency. This guy has no interest in Britain. For him to be funding any organisation called Best for Britain is laughable.
What?
This guy...
Well, he's pro-European Union, Tim, isn't he? I mean, what we do know is that he believes in the European project. That's what we do know.
Yeah, well, he believes in the European project. He believes in his own bank balance. He's funding organisations that are putting out false messages that the media are picking up on. And every time we hear this, there's Russian interference, and then they do investigations into it and they find out it's minuscule and it has no effect on the result. What does have an effect is this huge amount of money that he's been pumping in to all these campaigns run by the likes of Gina Miller and so on. They're the campaigns that this country should be fearful of, and they're the campaigns that are going to damage us and potentially put us back into a second referendum, which we could end up going back into the EU.
Right. No, well, Tim, I think this guy's hugely influential. I've just learned that Gina Miller's denying this money, which I find pretty extraordinary. But, Tim, what I do know is there are factual accounts of the $1 million he gave to Media Matters back in 2010 in America, an organisation that basically tries to go after advertisers that use Fox News and others, and he gave 160,000 sterling to Hope Not Hate Education Limited in this country. Tim, we're going to find out the full truth over the next few days. I suspect you're going to be proved right. That's my view. Fred is calling from York, another new caller. Good evening, Fred.
Hi, Nigel. How are you doing today?
Yeah, so, Fred, tell me, we've always had foreign interference of some kind. Can we ever stop it?
Yeah, I don't think that's possible to stop it. I think the UK government's to blame we've tried to influence other people historically. Other people have tried to influence us. If we go right back to the old rumour that Napoleon was very short, that was something spread by the UK media. So I think this is something that's happened throughout history. I don't think it's something that we can stop doing. You can't restrict someone's free will to try and influence something. So have the open discussion about it, but don't try and ban it. Don't try and stop it, because you'll just drive it underground, and that's exactly what we don't want.
Right. So, we did have, back in 2001, the PPERA, an Act of Parliament that was designed to stop, unnecessary, excessive and foreign interference in the political process. But it's actually quite clear, isn't it, Fred, that whether you're a resident of New York, as George Soros is, or wherever you live, if you've got a UK company that's actively trading, you can put the money in anyway, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And same if you're a UK citizen, you can go and try and influence somewhere else. It's not particularly hard to do. I don't think you can stop it. I don't think it's reasonable to ask to stop it. If someone wants to invest money in the UK and spend it trying to sort of change the political landscape, well, fair on them. We'll take that money, we'll spend it. But I don't believe the great British citizen is stupid enough to be influenced by a bit of money. We'll take that off hands and think what we want to.
Well, it depends, Fred. It may depend how much money it is, mightn't it?
Well, at that point, it's blackmail and bribery, which I believe are criminal offences still. So if you're going to bribe me and blackmail me, then those are very different things.
Okay. No. Fred, I thank you. Now, it's very interesting. The story, £400,000 given by George Soros to Best for Britain, and I haven't seen that counted. However, Gina Miller says, contrary to misleading media reports today, I have no relationship with or work for Best for Britain. I encourage Best for Britain and all those who play their part in the Brexit debate to be open and honest about what they stand for whom they represent and why they're funded. Separately, Miller told City AM that claims that Soros was funding some of her recent work were ridiculous, and she relies entirely on her own funds and pro bono work of other professionals. So Gina Miller is saying she is not part of Best for Britain, but she encourages Best for Britain. But the claim that £400,000 was given by Soros to Best for Britain has not been challenged. Mike is calling from Edinburgh. Good evening, Mike.
Good evening, Nigel. You really made me cross this evening. You're quite the hypocrite. I distinctly remember seeing you on television during the American election.
Yep.
Castigating Hillary Clinton. And I'm pretty sure the Americans have a law passed in 1848 saying there should be no European influence. So what's going on there? Can you square that for me?
I gave them a cheque, Mike, but it was less than £1 billion. No, Mike, I didn't give them any money at all. What I'm talking about is foreign interference in either the electoral process or political debate that is not. And our previous caller, Fred, made the point that you'll never stop foreign interference, because people will have UK companies or whatever it is, but that it needs to be open. So, Mike, I promise you, I didn't channel a penny into the American elections.
But you did influence the political debate. I clearly saw you on television. I saw you then again in the foyer of Trump Tower, and the journalist asked you, why are you here? And with a smug look on your face, you said, I'm here on a tourist visa. And now, to me, that makes you knew what you were doing as well. Even by your standards, this is hypocrisy.
Well, Mike, when I said that, the election was over, so I don't think it mattered very much. I did speak with Trump on a stage in Mississippi, and I spoke about Brexit, and I spoke about change, and I did say that I had very grave reservations about Hillary Clinton. You're right. But, actually, President Obama came to this country and told us not to vote for Brexit. So I think in terms of political endorsements, or whether they're positive or negative, Mike, they happen all over the world. I'm talking about the influence here of big money and billions of pounds of it. I mean, do you accept the difference?
Yes, I do. I do accept the difference between the billions of pounds, because one of the ways you influence the media is you purchase lots of advertisement space. We have seen that happen. So I concede the point. It's not. I don't disagree with that part of it. I know the mechanism for how it's done. HSBC did it. I believe it was with the Telegraph, and was it Peter Hitchens resigned or something like that?
It wasn't Hitchens, it was Peter Oborne. Mike, I get the point. I thank you, but I didn't give them a penny. I promise you, I haven't got it anyway. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 7:30. As the Best for Britain campaign receives £400,000 from Hungarian-born American citizen George Soros, I'm asking, is there too much overseas influence in Western democracy? I'm concerned about the size and scale of what Soros does. You maybe think I'm wrong and think that it's the Russians, because there's quite a lot of people been saying that ever since Brexit and Trump back in 2016. Meanwhile, David Davis has hit back at the European Union paper that had proposals that could punish Britain during the transition period. Davis has said that they are not acting in good faith, and it was unwise of them to do so. Well, I would say to David Davis, that's a good start quite a lot of us would like you to go a bit further. Is there too much foreign intervention? And I promise you, this Telegraph front page today about this money will lead, over the course of the next days and weeks, to a lot more stories about organisations that George Soros is involved with and has funded, not just in this, but in many other Western countries. And, LBC have an open invitation to George Soros to come and be interviewed in the interests of transparency. Chris is calling from Stoke-on-Trent, a new caller. Is there too much foreign interference, Chris, or could we never stop it anyway?
I don't think you'll stop it. I don't think it really matters, to be honest.
OK.
Would you accept a George Soros' form of money if it got you the Brexit that you wanted?
Not if it was illegal, Chris, no. Not if it was illegal. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that what Soros is doing is illegal. What I am suggesting is we have not had a conversation about the huge scale of influence this man has had right across the West for many, many years. So I wouldn't accept illegal money, Chris. But would I accept money, legal money, to get the Brexit I want? Well, of course, and both sides of the argument would.
Yeah, I agree. I accept every penny.
I mean, but it has to be. We do actually have pretty strict laws in this country, and it's why when Ben Bradshaw, the Labour MP for Exeter, gets up in the House of Commons and sort of throws out these claims that the Leave side, had Russian money involved with them, that I get pretty angry, because I just do not believe anybody that was involved with the Brexit campaign would have been stupid enough to take illegal money.
Well, I'm an everyday voter, and it certainly didn't influence me.
No.
I can't see how it influenced anybody else across the country. But I think the Leave campaign, they're missing a trick.
Go on.
Because Donald Trump did an interview with Piers Morgan a couple of weeks ago.
Yep.
And one thing he said is he did not like the EU deal that America have got. And I think he said a figure of 650 billion. If David Davis's team got Trump involved with the negotiations, surely the EU have got to pay more attention to the figures being involved then than what we're throwing at them.
Well, Chris, yeah, that's part of a negotiation strategy as opposed to money, going back and forth. But you could argue, of course, that would be getting foreign influence involved. And when I'm asking this question, I'm really asking about cash and about money. But, Chris, you say bits of money here on either side will never influence things. But do you accept my point that normally when rich people set up their own institutes or want to donate money to campaigns, it's a few million here. It sounds flippant, doesn't it? A few million there. But when we're dealing with George Soros' Open Society, we're talking about $20+ billion. It is of a different scale, isn't it?
It is of another scale, but it's the same principle. I don't think that... I'm from Stoke. I don't think the people of the streets of Stoke have even heard of George Soros.
No, they haven't, Chris. You're absolutely right. And I bet a lot of people tonight listening to this show have never heard of George Soros, but they have heard of the story that Russian money influenced things. And, hey, I'm all ears, folks. If you think Russian money did, call me and tell me that. But if somebody is, Chris, kind of below the radar and funding lots of organisations who are all fighting in the same direction, surely we deserve to know about it.
Of course, it just seems to be all one-way traffic that if Brexit and Trump are funded by the Russians, that seems to be a bad thing. Yet the EU funded by George Soros, there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, well, I think there's some truth in that, Chris. But I don't accept, by the way, that Brexit and Trump were funded by the Russians.
No, I don't think they were for 1 minute, but that's just the way the media perceive it.
There's a bit of a double standard here, Chris, isn't there?
Very much so, yes.
Yeah. No, listen, matey, thank you for your call. Thanks very much indeed. Soros should mind his own blooming business, says Richard. Nigel, you seem to have conveniently forgotten a certain Rupert Murdoch. Last time he checked, he influences who becomes the UK PM. He supported Brexit too, says Dr. Ralph. Well, actually, Rupert Murdoch, not much doubt about it, that way back in 1992, that famous headline, "It's the Sun what won it," and maybe it did back in 1992. I don't think mainstream media has quite the same influence today. Nigel, it's the people who decide our future, not George Soros. He can spend his billions on trying to influence a Remain vote, but it won't work, says David. David, you may very well be right, and that was the point we got from Chris in Stoke-on-Trent. Spend what you like, you ain't changing our minds. But the reason I gave that speech in the European Parliament back in November is I felt something very big, something very significant was going on, and nobody was even talking about it. So I cheered that Telegraph front page today. Nigel, we've always had foreign interference from the EU. That is why we want out, says Kathy. Well, that's true. The biggest foreign interference is most of our laws have been made somewhere else. And another text saying that Rupert Murdoch is incredibly powerful and, of course, Australian-born, but now a US citizen. David is calling from Uxbridge. Good evening, David.
Yeah, hi, Nigel. What I would like to say is just counter the narrative, really, that, you know, like the Brexit was some grassroots, working class-driven agenda. Brexit had elite money, anonymous money funneled through the DUP in Northern Ireland, that there was an investigation. And these donors are not, you know, they use think tanks. So it's a complex thing, Brexit. You know, there's part of what you call the capitalist society, like Soros, that are very globalist, you know, want an EU. But there's also people that see as an opportunity for deregulation, low tax, turn Britain into... You know, so there's elite money on both sides, Nigel, and you know that very well. And I think to portray it just as this grassroots working class movement isn't really the full picture.
Well, David,
that doesn't mean you didn't get working class.
David, I haven't said that tonight, have I? I have not said that it was working class money that got Brexit, although it may have been many, many working class votes. And David, be fair, you know, I have said there are rich people who will put money on both sides of any particular argument. What I'm saying, David, and, you know, I accept your basic point, I really do. But what I'm saying is that, you know, when there's so much talk in the press about Russian money, and my name constantly linked to all of this, when actually, after a massive investigations, you know, nothing concrete in any way has been proven at all. What I am saying, David, is that the influence of this man and his organisation, Open Society, is of a different level to anything Western democracies have ever seen before.
Yeah, but you know, you could be right, but we need transparency. We need to think about think tanks. We need to think about lobbying. Yep. You know, why don't those anonymous donors? Why are they anonymous? Same, all these think tanks that are advising the government are you know, it's quite plutocratic. It's corrupt. People don't really know, you know, it's, you know, what, you know, who's funding what. You know, we've got the debt, you know, short of America, we've got the best democracy money can buy. You know, the Tory party conference has got more lobbyists than delegates.
I know.
You know, and you're looking at it breaking down now with Carillion and the crony capitalism, you know, and I can understand why people voted for Brexit, because they feel alienated. But, you know, personally, I don't think it's going to answer the economic pain that people are in. You know, that's my view. You differ. Sure. But, you know, I think the EU is the wrong target, you know, in some ways. I'm not saying it's not. It's a democrat. You know, there's democratic deficits in it, and there's sovereignty and all that. But you have to look at finance capitalism, the corporations, the lobbying, and all that.
David, you're quite right. There are wealthy people on both sides of the argument, some who supported Remain. Basically, generally, they were the corporates, and some that supported and backed financially Leave, and they tended to be the entrepreneurs, and they had two different agendas. And you're right about that. I'm going to repeat the point, David, and thank you for the call. I'm going to repeat the point. The reason I gave that speech in November is that this particular man's organisation has money on a scale we've never, ever seen. We normally think somebody puts a couple of million quid into a campaign either side, that is a major donation. We're dealing here with an organisation that has tens of billions. It's of a different order, and it ought to be discussed. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on RBC. It's 7:45. The establishment are obsessed that Russian money influenced not just President Trump winning the presidency in America, but also influenced the Brexit vote too. To date, despite all the screaming and all the shouting, they've barely produced a shred of evidence. And yet, there is this Hungarian-born, American resident billionaire George Soros, whose organisation, Open Society, has had over $20 billion pumped into it, that is funding a whole host of organisations, one of which we learned this morning is Best for Britain, a group campaigning to keep Britain in the European Union, fighting for a second referendum, and we know of £400,000 they've received. We also know that George Soros is pro-EU. He's pro-mass migration. He's pro some very fundamental changes in our society, and he's funded, in America, Britain, and across Europe, many groups who fundamentally want to change the way in which we live. You will hear more about that through our newspapers over the course of the coming days. I am not suggesting for one moment that anything he's done is illegal, but I am suggesting we've not had a conversation about a man who is now the biggest single potential political influence in the whole of the Western world. I tried to raise that debate back in November. I was roundly abused for doing so, and I'm very grateful to the Daily Telegraph for carrying on with that story. Is there too much foreign interference, or doesn't it really matter? Joe in St Albans is my next caller. Good evening.
Hello, Nigel. Good evening. Nice to speak to you again.
What do you think, Joe? Too much foreign interference or nothing we can do about it?
Well, I was going to make 2 points this evening, Nigel, and I say this from the position of being a reluctant Remain voter in the first place, but pretty accepting of the vote now. So the first point is that I think that the alleging that the Russians were involved in somehow producing the Brexit result slightly plays into the Brexit will be a disaster playbook. I mean, in fact, there are several results of Brexit that are actually going to be quite bad for the Russians, I think. If you look at it from the point of view of an emboldened global Britain and all of Theresa May's jargon, but then you could look at it from the point of view of, well, would they want an EU army on their doorstep? Would they want a federal Europe on their doorstep? I don't think they would. Well, what they certainly don't want is an expansionist Europe to the eastwards on their doorstep, and that is much of what that Ukraine fight was all about. So I can see, Joe, actually, how the other side to me can cook up the story that the Russians funded it because they were scared of it, because they are genuinely scared of eastward expansion. But I think that there are a lot of aspects of Brexit and a lot of products of Brexit that are actually quite bad for the Russians. So the idea that they cooked up is only believable if you believe that us leaving the European Union is a terrible thing for the UK and the EU. I don't know that it actually is. Yeah, and Joe, there's no evidence, despite all the screaming and shouting, and my name constantly mentioned in certain newspapers in connection with this, not a shred of evidence. What's the other point you've got, Jay? The other point I had is it relates to the referendum specifically. I just wanted to make the point that had the referendum have been correctly organised and planned, it would have been binding, and any amount of money raised since to overturn the result would be completely and utterly irrelevant. Well, you know what, Joe? You may well be right. You may well be right. It may not matter how much money is spent on either side, but I just have a feeling that the way Open Society do it is a bit cleverer than just chucking money at any individual campaign. It is about changing a debate that goes on within society. Joe, I thank you. Nigel, George Soros can fly over throwing his money out of an aeroplane, but it won't make a bit of difference because we have the pen at the ballot box. You know, I don't know who you are that sent that. The whole point is what campaigns try to do, whether they're pro or anti a particular argument, what they try to do is they try to dominate the media agenda. They try to control the narrative, and that, I think, is what Soros... If Soros wanted to be involved in direct politics, he would have set up political parties. He hasn't. He's doing it in a subtle way. He's been doing it below the radar. I've done my best to try and blow the gaff on that. The Daily Telegraph, I think, have upped the game very considerably. Steve is calling from Ruislip. Good evening, Steve.
I've got to say, sometimes I'm really concerned about some of the things you say. I cannot get past the fact that you've had funds from a person who offshores, $7.5 million from Aaron Banks into UKIP or leave EU.
Hang on, Steve. Steve. Whoa, down there. He's a UK taxpayer.
He's an offshore taxpayer. Gibraltar, British Virgin Islands, and all of the above.
So are you against... Steve, let me just get this right. Do you think British businessmen should not have businesses or investments overseas?
Well, surely.
Is that what you're saying?
Soros is a businessman as well. The point is that
I have not suggested, Steve. Steve, have I, that Soros has done anything illegal. What I have suggested.
To keep mentioning illegality puts doubt in people's minds.
No, you did that, not me.
And disingenuous. No. I'm telling you, I'm putting in people's minds now to make sure they're clear of where you're coming from.
I've said it 4 times. I've said it 4 times in 55 minutes that there is. I'm not suggesting that Soros has done anything illegal. But I am suggesting, Steve. I am suggesting, Steve.
Why?
I am suggesting, Steve, this is the biggest, most heavily funded political campaign that has been seen in history. And before today, we haven't even talked about it.
With UKIP wasn't exactly a small chunk of change either, or 7.5 million, or any other corporation like Mr. Wilson's Next, or who have got a view on Brexit. My point is whether you're pro or against Brexit. This isn't the point here. You're talking about influence here. So let's get past all of this other stuff and let's talk about the nuts and bolts of this.
Well, I tell you what, Steve. Let's talk about the nuts and bolts of it. All right. The biggest ever single donation in British politics to a political party has been £5 million, I think. That's the biggest ever. But you're quite right. Rich people on both sides of the argument throw money at things they believe in and they want. Compare 5 million here and 5 million there with $20 billion.
But he hasn't spent that, has he?
They've spent 15 already.
Well,
they've spent $15 billion on their causes already.
Well, and Aaron Banks spent $7.5 billion. So that's half that amount just from one individual.
No, Steve. Can we please get this right? Aaron Banks spent $7.5 million. George Soros's Open Society has so far spent $15 billion. This is Steve. No, not on this, but on his global influence.
So let's stop equating it to like some tinkering with Brexit and everything like that. You wanted to touch on the Russian thing as well, and I don't think that they're totally blameless in certain things around the world. Mr. Putin's got some self-interest as well for some of the things he does. They're not whiter than white or something special. Like most individuals, the Russians are looking for certain marketplaces, and they're also looking to have sanctions lifted and all sorts. So none of these people are beyond the touch of the hand.
No, Steve, I accept that. I genuinely accept that, and I accept all of you that have rung in tonight to make the point that wealthy people and corporations on either side of an argument are fully entitled within our democratic system to put money into backing their point of view, their passion, maybe even their business interest. I accept that. The argument, folks, I'm making is all the Russian conspiracy stuff has come to naught. And despite investigations, questions in Parliament and all the rest of it, and I'm saying, if ever there was an investigation needed, it was the extent to which George Soros' Open Society has attempted to change the political climate, not just in Britain, but across the entire Western world. That's the investigation we need. You've been listening to The Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'm back on Sunday morning at 10 tonight. It's Ian Collins, but up next, it's Clive Bull.
Nigel, thank you.